Snow had fallen from morning into night, thick enough to swallow even the sound of horses in its white hush. Clay Ridge, the small town set between two jagged Colorado ranges, seemed to hold its breath on Christmas Eve. Wind struck the wooden eaves hard enough to shake the lanterns, and the road toward Yosemite Pass had been closed since early afternoon. The sheriff hung a sign at the top of the slope. No vehicle can pass. Yet as dusk settled, the faint clatter of iron against a wagon frame rose from the distance, uncertain, almost like an echo appearing in the wrong winter dream. People inside the saloon paused. Gideon Bale lifted his head. He stood beneath the awning of the copper lantern, a cigarette unlit between his fingers. 7 years alone on the Timberline Ridge had turned him into the quiet kind, well known in Clay Ridge because he kept to himself. Old coat, hat pulled low, eyes that kept a steady distance from everyone else. But when the wagon emerged from the blurred snow, Gideon felt something inside him pull tight, as if a hand had brushed against a memory he had tried to bury. The wagon stopped sharply at the steps. The door opened. A slender gloved hand rested on the frame, as if searching for a trace of warmth in this cold world. Then Nadine Holt stepped down. Snow caught in her dark hair. Her heavy coat hung wet from wind and sleet. Her face held both firmness and disorientation. In a mining town where most were white settlers, the arrival of a young black woman from the east struck like a pocket of fire in the storm, quieting the place until even the wind seemed to shift. Nadine hesitated when her boots touched the ground. Something in her eyes, part tremor, part caution, suggested this wasn't a destination, but a place she had no choice but to cross. Gideon didn't know why he stepped off the porch. He only knew that when her gaze lifted and locked with his, the space around them tightened, as if he had seen something familiar, or something his life might have held 10 years ago, had it not been crushed by loss. Sheriff Avery approached. "Gideon," he called over the wind, "I need you up on Yosemite Pass. A snowslide cut off the summit post. This young woman and her uncle need to go with you. They're the last witnesses to the missing freight wagon." Gideon frowned. "Tonight? No one knows that pass like you. By sunrise, it might be too late." Nadine looked between them, still piecing together what was happening. Her elderly uncle stood behind her, shoulders shaking, breath short. A strong gust tore Nadine's hat away. She reached for it, but another blast pushed her off balance. Before she could fall, a steady hand caught her elbow. "Gideon." Nadine looked up. At this distance, she could see the faint cloud of his breath in the snow. She managed a quiet thank you, but her hand lingered on his longer than necessary. Even with the wind stinging, the place where he touched her felt distinctly warm. "Shouldn't stand in the path of the gusts," Gideon said, voice low and rough from cold. She let go, flustered. "I thought I'd be fine." "No, you're not fine." Gideon held her gaze a moment too long. "You don't belong to a winter like this." Nadine blinked, as if he had seen through the strong front she'd carried since dawn. The sheriff cut in. "No more time. Gideon, saddle up. They're going with you." Nadine turned to steady her uncle. Her thin hand brushed Gideon's calloused one. A small touch, but enough to still them both for a beat. A forced journey. 3 people, 2 horses, and a night of snow that promised nothing but danger. Under the lantern glow, Nadine tightened her cloak and scarf. Gideon pulled the reins firm, giving her one more look, not to judge her, but as if to remember her. The storm roared. Clay Ridge shrank to a single streak of light in the endless white. Then the two of them, an Eastern girl carrying secrets and a cowboy accustomed to his own darkness, took the slope toward Yosemite Pass. No one could say why. But it was clear this night would change everything. The road out of Clay Ridge was narrow and steep, barely wide enough for two horses side by side in clear weather. But tonight, the wind cut across so hard that Gideon had to ride in a single line, Nadine in the middle, her uncle behind her on the town's strongest horse. Snow slanted across them, stinging their faces like small blades. "Hold the saddle tight," Gideon called out, though the wind swallowed half his voice. Nadine nodded, lowering herself against the storm. But as the road rose and the ground beneath the hooves turned slick as ice, she faltered. Her horse slid slightly to the side. Instinct drove her hand out, landing on Gideon's back. He glanced over his shoulder. "Can you stay up?" "Yes," Nadine answered, but her hand remained on his back, the warmth through his wool coat steadying her more than she wanted to admit. They rode in long silence, the kind only mountain winters knew, where even a breath sounded louder than the wind. Her uncle coughed now and then. Nadine kept her posture straight, eyes fixed on the white blur ahead. Slowly, the lantern tied to Gideon's saddle cast a small circle of light, enough for them to see each other's outlines in the dark. "What brings you to Colorado?" Gideon asked. He didn't look back. His voice was low, cautious, as if he didn't want the answer, but had to ask. After a moment, Nadine said, "I came to find a place where no one knows who I am." Gideon considered that. Running from something? Not exactly. Her breath drifted into the snow. "I want to start over." He gave a slight nod, as if he understood that more than he planned to admit. "And you?" she asked. "Why would a man like you live alone on timberline for 7 years?" Gideon tightened the reins. "Old history." Nadine tilted her head. Old history is usually the thing people remember most. This time Gideon didn't answer, but the silence he held was heavier than the storm, heavy enough that Nadine sensed the shadow lodged somewhere behind his eyes. She knew she had pressed on a wound he wasn't ready to open. They traveled a long stretch more, breath mixing with the cold, each hoofbeat sounding like an uneven pulse in the snow. Nadine studied the way Gideon led, the lantern swinging with the rhythm of his hand, the subtle pulls of the reins, the way he shifted to keep both of them steady. "You ride well," she said quietly, just loud enough for the wind to carry it to him. Gideon paused a fraction. "I just know the trail." "Not the trail, you," she corrected gently. "I've never seen anyone make a stubborn horse move that calm." He didn't turn, but she saw his shoulders tighten, an odd reaction for a man who seemed unmoved by anything. The cold worsened, forcing them to find shelter. Gideon guided them toward a large rock hollow on the mountainside, just big enough for 2 horses and 3 people huddled from the wind. He set a hide as a windbreak and started a small fire. When Nadine sat down, her hands shook, though she held herself firm. "Do you need a blanket?" Gideon asked. She nodded. He handed her his thickest one. When their hands touched, both stilled, only a breath, but waited like something held back too long. Her uncle leaned against the rock wall, already asleep from exhaustion. Firelight climbed over Nadine's face, her shadow rising on the stone like a soft sketch resting against winter. "Thank you," she whispered. Gideon only nodded, but his gaze lingered on her cheek longer than necessary. Night deepened. The wind shifted, sending low, hollow gusts across the hollow like distant howls. Nadine pulled the blanket close, inching nearer the fire. Gideon rose to check the horses when a heavy sound echoed outside. Not wind, not snow. A deep, weighted crash, as if something had collapsed on the mountainside. Nadine's head snapped up, eyes wide. Gideon's hand tightened around the grip of his gun. "Stay there," he said softly, but his voice froze the air in the hollow. The white night of Colorado was not done with them yet. The sound came again, louder, deeper, like a furnace stone cracking, but stretched long enough to shake the mountain's core. Gideon caught only a glimpse of the darkness outside the hollow, and everything happened in a single heartbeat. "Avalanche!" he shouted. Without waiting another second, Gideon lunged forward, wrapped his arms around Nadine, and pulled her hard against him, forcing her down. Her face pressed into his chest. His back curved over her head and shoulders, forming a living shield. Nadine heard his heartbeat clearly, strong, fast, pounding straight into her ribs. In that instant, she understood. This man, after barely a night of knowing her, had chosen to put his life over hers. The ground trembled. A cloud of snow dust swept in like thick fog. A deep roar, like a distant sea breaking against rock, echoed through the pass before fading. The hollow held, but the cold that rushed in made Nadine shiver uncontrollably. Gideon kept her close a moment longer, then slowly eased his arms. "You all right?" he asked, voice rough and close. Nadine didn't answer at once. Her hand was still on his chest, feeling the raw pulse that had protected her. "I'm all right. Because of you," she said softly. Gideon stood, brushing the snow from his coat. As he turned, he winced. Only then did Nadine see blood seeping through the fur-lined shoulder of his jacket. A long tear, likely from sharp rock. "You're hurt," she blurted. "It's just a scrape," he said, already dismissing it. She stepped closer before he could turn away. "If you don't let me look at it, I won't rest," Nadine said, her tone firm enough to stop him. She removed her gloves. Her warm brown hand settled on his cold arm. Gideon went still. Nadine pulled back the heavy coat, then the wool underneath, revealing a red gash across his skin. She tore a strip from her own scarf and cleaned the blood. Each time she touched him, he tightened his jaw but didn't pull away. "You don't have to." "Quiet," Nadine murmured. "Let me handle it." Silence settled between them, dense enough that Gideon turned his face aside, afraid she'd read the pulse he couldn't steady. Her uncle stirred awake, tried to rise and nearly collapsed. Gideon caught him. "His legs twisted," Gideon said after a quick check. "He can't climb. We need better shelter." The storm surged again, wind cutting across the slope too sharply for anyone to stand long. Gideon strapped on his coat and pulled the horses to the mouth of the hollow. "There's an old cabin a mile from here," he said. "If we want to survive the night, that's where we go." Nadine helped her uncle onto the horse. Gideon steadied him from behind. They moved through a dense white mist of falling snow. The only light, the faint swing of Gideon's lantern. By the time they reached the cabin, Nadine was so cold she could no longer feel her fingers. The small wooden shelter was old, weathered, but standing. Gideon shoved the door open with his shoulder. Damp wood and old ash breathed out. "Go in," he said. Nadine stepped inside first. Her uncle sank onto a worn rug near the wall. Gideon lit a fire quickly, each movement practiced, neat enough that Nadine watched without blinking. As the flames rose warm and yellow, Nadine's face came into view, dark eyes deep, lashes tipped with snow, breath still unsteady. Gideon looked at her, longer than necessary. She looked back, longer than she meant to. Neither spoke. But something thin and wordless pulled taut between them, a thread tied since the avalanche. Gideon adjusted a blanket over her uncle, checked the wound on his shoulder, then sat near the fire. Nadine sat across from him, only an arm's length away. The fire flickered between them. "You saved me," she said quietly, eyes fixed on him. "No," Gideon said, voice low. "I just did what had to be done." Nadine tilted her head, meeting his gaze. "To me, that's different." Gideon didn't answer. He simply held her look, a long, steady look, with no attempt to hide anymore. Outside, the white night kept falling. Inside the cabin, there was only the crackle of fire, the nearness of breath, and the truth neither dared speak. They would be trapped here together for the night. A night too long, too cold, and far too easy for a heart to tremble. The small cabin held only enough firelight to warm one corner of the room. Wind cut through the door cracks, each whistle sounding like a threat pressing against the night outside. Nadine's uncle slept heavily under an old blanket, his breathing rough but steady. In the narrow cabin, there were only two places to rest, a small wooden bed and a thick rug spread near the fire. Nadine stood still for a long moment, not from shyness, but because she wasn't used to the absolute silence of a mountain night. Gideon unfastened the straps of his coat, the heavy garment falling to the floor with wet weight from melted snow. "I'll dry them by the stove," he said. But as he pulled off the layer beneath, Nadine froze. Under the thin wool were old scars running across his shoulder and back, dark ridges, each one a story no one had ever been told. Nadine stepped forward half a pace, then stopped, breath tightening. "Gideon," she whispered. He turned away, as if already practiced at avoiding pity. "Just old history, not worth mentioning." But to Nadine, those scars said more than any explanation. This man who had lived apart for 7 years wasn't only avoiding people, he was avoiding his own memories. "Let me check your shoulder again," she said, steadying herself. Gideon meant to refuse, but once Nadine moved close, he seemed unable to send her away. She laid her hand on his arm, warm, soft, certain, and he went still. Nadine gently removed the cloth she had tied earlier. Firelight showed the red cut clearly. She leaned in, close enough that her breath touched his skin. Gideon inhaled sharply, barely. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Not in the way you think," he said, voice low. The words made Nadine pause, her heartbeat striking hard and uneven. She rewrapped his shoulder, each touch so careful that Gideon couldn't tell if it was the wound burning or something deeper. When she drew the cloth across his neck, their faces came close, only a breath between them. Nadine felt his warmth brush her lips. Gideon saw the fire reflected in her dark eyes deep enough to pull him towards something both strange and familiar. "You have many scars," she said softly, "but none of them make you look weaker." He let out a faint laugh, a tired, honest sound. "Around here, people think scars are reminders. I think they're reasons not to get close." Because you fear people will ask about them? She asked. He shook his head. Because I fear they'll touch me and make me remember. Those words went straight into Nadine's chest. She didn't ask more. Instead, she placed her hand over his fist, gently easing it open. Gideon didn't pull away. Tell me, Nadine murmured, what frightens you that much? He stayed silent a long moment. The fire cracked softly. The storm outside moaned like something urging him on. I lost everything in one winter, he said, his voice low as wind. My father, the ranch, and any reason I had to believe in anything, including myself. Since then, I just wanted a place no one came to, not because I'm strong, but because I'm afraid of connection enough that I don't look anyone in the eye for longer than a beat. Nadine moved closer. Gideon, fear doesn't make you weak. It makes you real. Only then did she notice her hand was still on his. He didn't move away. Instead, he turned his palm and laced his fingers with hers, as if that warmth was the only real thing left in the cold. And you? He asked. Colorado is where people come to hide. What are you hiding from? Nadine's breath caught. Pressure, she said. Judgment. And the feeling of never being enough. Back east, they saw my skin before they saw me. I came here to find out if stepping off the path they chose for me would let me find myself. Gideon looked into her eyes, longer, deeper than any look before. Nadine, he said quietly, here, I see you. She bit her lip, her throat tightening. And I don't scare you? She asked. Gideon shook his head. A small, certain shake, like a vow. No, Nadine, he whispered. You're not frightening at all. She didn't know why the word you, spoken that way, sent heat through her chest. But when Gideon added, voice low and painfully honest, she knew the night had changed everything. The only frightening thing, he paused, his eyes flicking to her mouth, is how much I want to be closer to you than I should. Morning came slowly, as if even the sun hesitated to rise through the heavy snow. Nadine woke to the faint fall of dying embers and the cold leaking through every crack of the cabin. Her uncle slept on, his breathing steadier than the night before, though his pale lips kept her uneasy. Gideon was packing near the door, coat partly dried, his hand moving quickly as he tied what they needed to bring. When his eyes flicked toward Nadine, he paused for half a second, long enough for her to notice. We need to leave before the snow gets thicker, he said, voice low, guarded after what happened last night. Nadine nodded. She knew the night before had shifted them both, but neither spoke of it. They kept distance, as if a single word might melt the defenses each had carried for years. They lifted her uncle onto Gideon's horse, securing him to the saddle, and Nadine climbed onto the horse behind Gideon. When a gust hit the mountainside, Nadine instinctively placed her hand on his hip for balance. Gideon tensed immediately, but he didn't pull away. Heat rose through his coat under her palm, and Nadine felt his heartbeat, quick, uneven, something he hadn't meant to reveal. Sorry, she murmured. It's fine, he answered, though half his voice was roughened. They rode in silence. Not a distant silence, a tightened one where every breath and every shift made them more aware of each other. As the road grew rougher, Nadine asked, You didn't sleep, did you? I'm fine. You always say that, she said softly, but enough to make him turn his head. None of this is your fault, Gideon. Not my uncle, not last night, not— Gideon pulled the reins sharply, the horse jolting to a stop. Nadine leaned forward, her hands brushing his hip again. You don't know what you're saying, Gideon said, voice stretched tight like a rope pulled too far. You're blaming yourself for everything, she replied, sliding off the horse as he did the same, as if they were forced to face it. They stood in still snow, breath rising in white curls. The wind cut through, but Nadine's gaze didn't waver. Why do you carry everything on your back? She asked. Because that's how I survived, he said quietly. And if you knew how badly I failed before— She stepped toward him. Gideon reflexively stepped back half a pace, then stopped. Nadine lifted her face only a breath from his. You're not the only one who's ever failed. His breath warmed her forehead, hotter than the cabin fire the night before. Don't try to understand me, Nadine, he said softly. I don't want to pull you into what I carry. You think I'm not strong enough? Gideon gripped the reins, his eyes darkening. Not angry at her, angry at himself for reacting. The moment tightened so sharply, it felt as if even the falling snow slowed. Close enough that Nadine heard his heartbeat. One hard beat, then a skipped one, like a confession he couldn't speak. They rode on in silence. But this silence was different, deepened, sharpened, no longer avoidance. When the outpost appeared through the pale mist, Nadine's uncle slumped behind them. Uncle? She called. No answer. Then his body slipped from its position. Uncle! She cried, her voice cracking the air. Gideon leapt down, catching the man before he hit the snow. Nadine's hands trembled as she touched her uncle's face. His breathing is so shallow, she whispered, eyes wide with fear. Nadine, look at me, Gideon said, placing a hand on her shoulder. But she didn't hear him. Her world shrank to one point, her only remaining family fading in her arms. Then Gideon wrapped his arm around her, steady but gentle, pulling her toward him. You're not alone. I'm here, he said at her ear, voice deep enough to keep her standing. She shook, not from cold. I'm scared of losing him, she whispered into his chest. I know, Gideon said, his hand on her back, slow and steady. He'll be all right. I promise. Nadine lifted her face, eyes red, and for the first time she didn't try to hide. She let herself lean into him, lightly, but for Gideon it felt like something he didn't know he'd wanted for years. The wind howled across the distant ridge, but in his arms the world lost some of its cold. Gideon tightened his hold, murmuring, Lean on me, just this once. But he knew it wasn't only once, and Nadine knew it too. The station workers carried Nadine's uncle into a warm room inside, with a fire, medicine, thick blankets, and someone watching over him. When Nadine saw he was being cared for, her legs went weak, as if she had stepped out of a battle she'd been fighting all night. Gideon stood close beside her, his hand still on her back, as if afraid the wind might take her away. Now we wait for the rescue team, he said quietly. They'll have to climb from the east, at least half a day. Nadine nodded, her eyes fixed on the door where her uncle had disappeared. I don't want to go far, she whispered. Not far, Gideon replied, the horses shifting behind them. Just back to the cabin. It's safer than standing out here. They set out again, snow so deep the horses sank past their knees. The path was short, but darkness fell fast. When the cabin emerged in the white haze, Nadine let out a breath, as if she were returning to the only place she could lay down even a fraction of her worry. Inside, the fire came back to life under Gideon's hands. Flames cast warm circles against the wooden walls, drawing the room smaller, closer, until their breaths met in the air. Nadine removed her cloak. Her damp curls fell over her shoulders. She stretched her hands toward the fire, warmth creeping slowly into her cold fingers. Gideon watched her longer than he meant to, then turned away, as if afraid a word might slip out. "Tonight, it'll be bitter cold," he said, trying for a steady tone. "I know." Silence grew between them, full of things neither had dared name. At last Gideon spoke, low, almost awkward. "I haven't touched anyone in 7 years." Nadine turned back to him. Firelight reflected in her eyes, making them deep as a midnight lake. "Why?" she asked. Gideon rested his hands on his knees, his head slightly bowed. "Because touching someone opens a door, and I just didn't want anyone stepping through. I was afraid of losing, afraid of hurting, afraid of dragging someone into my storm." Nadine stepped closer. "But last night, you held me." Gideon looked up. For a moment, Nadine saw everything in his eyes, the fear of a man who had lost too much, and the confusion of someone who, for the first time in years, wanted to hold on to something. "I couldn't stand the thought of you shaking out there," he said softly. "And because you make me feel—" He paused, unable to finish. "Like there's a place I can put my piece down." Nadine stood right in front of him, only a breath between them. "I felt safe in your arms," she whispered. "It's strange for me, but it's real." Gideon swallowed hard, as if her words had cracked something he'd kept locked for too long. Nadine touched his arm first, right where an old scar lay beneath the bandage she had wrapped the night before. Her fingers brushed it softly, like touching a note that couldn't bear too much weight. Gideon caught her hand, not to stop her, but to hold it. Held tight, then loosened, as if unsure he had the right. But unable to let go, Nadine sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder, breath mingling with breath. Nothing rushed. Only two people exhausted from running, from the world, and from themselves. A strand of her hair slipped across her forehead. Gideon lifted his hand and brushed it aside. A small gesture, yet it made her lean gently into his touch. "Nadine, I know." She lowered her forehead to his, slowly, letting the distance fall away. The fire cracked softly. Outside, the snow fell thick enough to silence the world. They didn't kiss immediately. They simply sat like that, forehead to forehead, breathing together, as if learning again how to exist beside another person. Then Nadine placed her hand on his chest. Gideon's heart jumped. One hard beat, then one unsteady, as something softer than fear cracked open inside him. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm not running." Gideon's hand slid to her back, drawing her closer, inch by inch, as if checking if she was real. When their lips met, it wasn't impulse. It was the gentleness of two broken people willing to try fitting themselves back together. The night was long, the fire warm, and outside the snow blurred heaven and earth into one white quiet. In the dim room, they found each other, not in haste, but in a new trust. For the first time, Gideon let someone touch the parts he'd hidden. For the first time, Nadine let herself rest in arms that judged nothing and demanded nothing. When everything calmed, Nadine lay against his chest, her ear on the slow, steady beat beneath his ribs. Gideon's hand moved across her back, learning every line as if it mattered. Outside, the snow still fell, but inside the cabin, a new warmth had begun, and they both knew that after this night, nothing in their lives would be the same. Morning came not with light, but with warmth. Nadine opened her eyes and realized she was still in Gideon's arms, her head resting on his chest, his breath steady against her hair. Outside, the storm had eased, leaving a quiet white sheet across the mountain. For a moment, neither of them spoke. No shame, no awkwardness, no pretending the night before hadn't happened. Nadine shifted slightly to see him better. Gideon opened his eyes as if he had been awake, afraid to move and disturb her. His gaze didn't hide, but something old, something like fear had returned to it. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft in a way even the fire couldn't match. Gideon answered with a breath that sounded like surrendering to his own heart. "Good morning, Nadine." They dressed, slow and quiet, not out of embarrassment, but because both wanted to stretch the last few seconds before reality slipped back in. Nadine tied her cloak without looking at him. "I can't go back east." Gideon stopped at once. Her words struck right at the place he had avoided for 7 years, the part of him that feared wanting, choosing, hoping. "Don't say that," he replied, though his voice wasn't steady. "I mean it. Nadine." "I'm not saying I'll stay in Colorado forever," she said. "Just, I can't return to the place that made me into a shadow." Gideon turned away, gripping his belt until his knuckles went white. "Don't make me think," he swallowed hard. "Don't make me think I have the right to keep you." Nadine stepped in front of him. "I'm not summer, Gideon. I'm not just passing through." He let out a faint, sad laugh. "You think I don't want to keep you? After last night?" He shook his head, avoiding her eyes. "I'm scared." "Of what?" she asked. "That I'm not enough," he whispered. "That you'll wake up, look around, and see you deserve more than a man who only knows how to survive." Nadine opened her mouth to answer, but a shout outside cut her off. "Anyone in there?" They both startled. The rescue team had arrived. The door burst open, cold air rushing in. 3 men in heavy coats stepped inside, bringing the noise of life back into the frozen world. "Nadine Holt?" one of them called. "Yes," she answered. "We got word from the outpost. Your uncle is being cared for. We'll take you down the mountain." Gideon stood by the fire, not stepping forward. Couldn't step forward. His eyes followed her like he was trying to hold on to one more moment, even knowing he couldn't. One of the rescuers looked between them with a knowing smile. "Rough night for you two, I guess." Nadine flushed. Gideon turned away, but not far. Just enough so he didn't have to hide the truth on his face. They packed up the cabin, preparing to leave. No one said goodbye. No one knew what words could fit. At the door, Nadine stopped. Gideon stood, a few steps back, gripping the wooden post as if he needed something solid to keep him from moving toward her. "Gideon," she said. He looked up, a long, quiet look, like a sentence neither of them had the courage to write aloud. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaking with the cold. "For everything." "I didn't do anything," he answered softly. You did more than you think. Gideon pressed his lips together, then finally let out the single truth he dared to show. Just make it down safe. Nadine stepped outside with the rescue team. The snow reached her calves, the horses stamped against it. Gideon stayed under the cabin's eave, unmoving. Nadine turned once before she disappeared into the white. He stood there, alone, tall, still, eyes fixed on her, afraid that if he blinked, she would vanish from his life entirely. The rescuer said something, but she didn't hear it. All she heard was her heartbeat, and the feeling that part of her remained back in the cabin, in the arms of that man. Gideon didn't follow, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't dare. He didn't dare believe in a future that close to a dream, didn't dare step beyond the eve, because if he followed her too far, he feared he'd never find his way back to the life he'd built from broken pieces. And when Nadine vanished behind the white pines, Gideon bowed his head, his fists trembling. The night had changed them, and this morning, they both knew the road ahead would only get harder. But what had begun could not be undone. 2 days passed after Nadine was brought back to Clayridge. The town inn at the foot of the mountain sat between wind and the smell of melting snow. Nadine rented a small attic room with a window facing the ridges, where she and Gideon had been trapped. Her uncle stayed in the room below, watched by the outpost doctor, his strength returning slowly, though he still needed rest. Nadine spent each morning preparing medicine, setting warm cloths on his forehead, wiping sweat from his temples, her movements gentle, though her eyes kept drifting toward the window. Each time the afternoon light slanted across the ridge, her heart tightened. She only said, "I'm thinking about the snow." But her uncle looked into her eyes, and he knew it was not just the snow. Across the valley, Gideon returned to his ranch, a place that had once sheltered him from the world, but after the cabin night, it felt too wide, too empty, too cold. He removed Blaze's saddle and set it on the fence as usual. But when he laid his hand along the horse's neck, he felt something missing. Missing the way Nadine's hand had gripped his coat when the wind surged. Missing her warmth behind him on the mountain road. Missing the quiet tone in her voice that softened him without trying. Gideon breathed deep, pressing everything down into the bottom of his chest. He entered the house, lit the lamp, set the kettle on the stove. The same familiar motions. But when he sat in his chair, the room felt twice its size. No firelight reflected in Nadine's eyes. No warm silence she carried with her. Only the four walls. Too still, too quiet. Meanwhile, Clayridge buzzed with talk. Rumors spread quickly. Gideon Bale saved some black girl in the storm. They were stuck in a cabin all night. She's from back east. She won't last here. Nadine overheard more than she wanted. At the market, women stared longer than necessary. At the diner, people exchanged glances when she took a seat. A child tugged at his mother's coat. "Is that the lady from the sheriff's story?" The mother pulled the child away at once. Nadine swallowed words she didn't speak. She knew these looks from the east. But seeing them in the one place she hoped to find freedom hurt in a different way. She returned to the inn, opened her door, and then froze as she glanced out the window again. Dusk had settled, turning the ridge into a pale lavender line, the ridge where she had left a piece of her heart. "You miss him, don't you?" Her uncle's tired but warm voice came from behind. Nadine didn't turn around. She watched the snow outside and said softly, "I don't know if I have the right to miss him." Her uncle sighed. The heart doesn't ask permission. But Nadine only pressed her lips together, her eyes faintly red. At the same time, Gideon rode along the north fence of his ranch. Each time he reached the trail leading to Clay Ridge, his hand tightened on chausson, the reins until his knuckles turned white. He wanted to go, wanted to ride to town, wanted to see her, just to be certain she was all right. But he didn't dare. He didn't dare break the truth he'd told himself, that he wasn't enough. He didn't dare let Nadine see how much he wanted her there. Blaze tossed his head, sensing the turmoil. Gideon stroked the horse's mane, eyes lifting toward the ridge where the last of the light faded. A long breath slipped out of him, the breath of a man losing to his own heart. That evening, after changing her uncle's cloths, Nadine stepped outside for air. The town was quiet, wind rolling in, snow swirling in small, twisting rings. She wrapped her arms around herself, turning to go back inside when hoofbeats stopped right in front of the inn. Nadine froze. Her heart struck so sharply she had to grip the railing. That sound, she had heard it in her mind for 3 days. A horse she could not mistake. She stepped onto the porch, slow, trembling. And when she saw that figure, tall, dusted with snow, coat lined in white frost, everything Nadine had held back shattered. She lifted a hand to her mouth as tears spilled before she could stop them. Not from weakness, but because he had come. Because she had never hoped for someone to come for her. Not until she met him. Nadine stood under the inn's overhang, tears still glinting on her cheeks as Gideon pulled his horse close. He dismounted, brushed snow from his coat, and for a moment they simply stood there, looking at each other as if 3 days apart had lasted longer than a winter. Neither reached out first. Neither stepped closer. Neither knew where to begin. At last, Nadine broke the silence. "What are you doing here?" Her breath trembled. She couldn't hide it. Gideon looked at her, a look both relieved and afraid, like a man who had fought himself too long before allowing his feet to move. "I needed to be sure you were all right. I'm fine." He pressed his lips together, lowered his head. "No, Nadine. I've never believed that, unless I see it for myself." The words made her eyes sting again, partly from feeling, partly from fear that all this was only a moment of weakness for him. "Gideon," she whispered, "we need to talk." He tightened his grip on the reins, as if they were the only thing keeping his hands from shaking. "I think so too." They stepped into the quiet hallway, where lantern lights stretched long shadows across the walls. Nadine stood at one end, Gideon at the other. The distance wasn't far, yet it felt like a whole mountain lay between them. Nadine spoke first. "These past 3 days, I waited for you." Gideon stiffened. "Don't say that, Nadine." "Why not?" she asked. And that was when Gideon said what he had held back since that morning. "Because I'm not someone worth staying for." His voice was deep, rough, honest enough to make Nadine's chest tighten. "You deserve something better. A life that breathes. A man without a weight on his back. A place without storms. Without broken pasts. You... Stop!" Her voice cut through his, stronger than she meant. Gideon went silent. She stepped closer, each step breaking through the walls he'd put up. "I don't need someone perfect," she said slowly. "I just need someone real." Gideon swallowed hard. "I don't want to pull you into life." "You think I'm that weak?" "No. He said it without hesitation. I'm afraid. If you stay, you'll see everything that makes me not enough. The hallway seemed to fall away then. Only their uneven heartbeats remained. Nadine exhaled, soft but steady. You don't get to decide your worth for me. Gideon dragged a hand through his hair, unable to contain the fear rising inside him. Nadine, I don't know how to keep someone. I don't know how to then learn. She didn't look away. If you want to. Gideon stared at her for a long time. Long enough for Nadine to think he might turn and walk out. But he didn't. He stepped forward. Only a breath separated them now. Nadine. His voice hitched. I've never dared hope someone would come back to me. She lifted her hand, steady, unafraid, and placed it on his chest, right above the heartbeat, pounding strong enough for her to feel. But I'm standing here, she said. And so are you. So stop running. Gideon closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, the fear was still there, but so was a quiet willingness. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers, breathing her in as if that breath held something he needed. Nadine. His voice sank into her shoulder. He bowed his head there, not from weakness, but because he had finally found a place to set down what he couldn't say. She wrapped her arms around him, drawing him closer without hesitation. No arguments, no proving anything. Only two hearts that no longer knew how to speak, only how to feel. When Gideon finally lifted his head, his eyes had changed. Not certain, but choosing. He took Nadine's hand. Not tight, but firm enough that she knew he wouldn't let go. Come with me, he said. Where? To the ranch. My place. She smiled faintly. And mine? Gideon answered without blinking. Yours is anywhere I am. Nadine didn't say another word. She let him lead her down the steps, out into the light fall of snow. And as they walked toward the horse, their hands stayed joined, a promise needing no voice. Gideon's ranch sat against the spine of the mountains, where the morning wind was sharp and afternoon sunlight fell like honey. To Nadine, it was an entirely different world. Back east, she read books, attended gatherings, and did what was expected of a polite woman. Here, everything demanded stronger hands, steadier feet, and a heart willing to be patient. On the first morning, Nadine tried chopping wood. She gripped the axe with both hands, trying to steady herself before the large log. Gideon stood a few steps away, arms crossed, eyes tracking her every movement. Just let me try, she said, though her hands were trembling. I didn't say a word, Gideon replied, but the hint of a smile betrayed how closely he was watching her attempt to be strong. She swung the axe. The first strike landed wrong, the blade veering off and slamming into a root. The shock rattled her arms, nearly knocking the axe from her grip. The second swing was better, until the handle slipped and the axe bounced back. Oh! She stumbled backward too quickly, tripped on a stump, and fell into the snow. Gideon rushed forward immediately, dropping to his knees. Your hands. Let me see. I'm fine. Just numb, she said, forcing a smile. He lifted her hand, turning it gently, checking each finger. You'll break something if you keep that up. Then I'll learn better, she shot back, chin tilted. Gideon stared at her for several seconds, then shook his head, half exasperated, half fond. You're stubborn. I know. He sighed, then wrapped his wool scarf tighter around her neck. The simple touch, soft, warm, close, stilled her breath for a moment. By afternoon, she was helping him clean the horse stalls. Cold wind whipped across the yard, sharp enough to make Nadine shiver violently. Blaze breathed warm air against her neck, but gust after gust still cut through her coat. Without a word, Gideon shrugged off his own jacket and draped it over her shoulders. Nadine pinched the sleeve between her fingers. His coat was thick, heavy, smelling of pine smoke and the cabin night. She wasn't sure what warmed her more, the coat or the quiet fact that he had put it on her without hesitation. That evening, Nadine cooked her first meal over the wood-burning stove. By instinct, she reached to move the pot and forgot the cloth. Ah! She jerked her hand back, a red mark forming across her palm. Gideon was at her side the instant she gasped, leaving the saddle straps behind. Let me see. It's just a small burn. You're going to kill me with worry, he muttered, though his voice was gentle. He brought cool water, holding her wrist steady under the stream. Nadine watched his fingers tighten around her forearm, strong, warm, steady. Her burn throbbed, but her heartbeat ran faster for a different reason. When he wrapped the cloth around her palm, Nadine lifted her uninjured hand and wiped the sweat along his collarbone, where a line of muscle showed beneath his shirt. Gideon stopped, looked at her. His breath hitched. The moment sat there, deep quiet, impossibly tender, long enough that neither dared look away first. Night settled over the ranch. They sat on the porch, saying nothing, watching the stars. Shoulder to shoulder, calm heartbeats. Nadine rested her head against his shoulder. Gideon froze for half a second, still unfamiliar with someone leaning on him, yet he didn't move away. Wind carried the scent of dry grass across the porch. A horse snorted softly in the barn. The world shrank to just the two of them. Inside the doorway, Nadine noticed old things on a high shelf, a small pair of boots, a carved piece of wood, a child's wool scarf. She looked at Gideon. These are? He didn't answer right away, only exhaled. What's left of my family. Nadine laid her bandaged hand over his. Gideon stared at that touch for a long time, as though it weighed as much as an entire winter. Finally, Nadine said softly, just for him, I want to stay here a little longer. Gideon turned sharply, disbelief in his eyes. Nadine, are you sure? She nodded. I've been running my whole life. Maybe it's time to stop, in a place that finally feels real. Gideon looked at her for a very long moment, long enough that she expected him to say something grand. But he didn't. He simply reached out and held her hand, lightly, carefully, like a man who finally believed he had the right to keep something precious. And that night, with the mountain wind howling beyond the porch, they sat close. Not because of the cold, but because this place was beginning to feel like a shared home. By late December, Clayridge glowed with warm lantern light, and the soft chiming of little bells hung from porch beams. The year-end festival was always the biggest event in town, an evening of pies, hot cider, laughter, and stories gathered across 12 long months. Nadine wore the wool coat Gideon had given her before they left the ranch. He walked beside her, one hand firm on Blaze's reins as if shielding her from the wind. The inn, the blacksmith shop, and the general store all shone bright. Children ran around the tall pine tree in the square, their shouts rising like sparks. But the moment Nadine and Gideon stepped into the center of the festival, the air shifted. A cluster of women near the pie stall paused their conversation. Their eyes lingered on Nadine, measuring, judging. Their whispers were low but sharp in the cold air. "That's her." The black girl the sheriff mentioned. "Don't know what Gideon Bale is thinking. Bringing someone like that to his ranch." Nadine heard every word, each one landing like cold stones in her chest. She lowered her gaze. Gideon stopped instantly. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't hurry her along. He didn't pretend the whispers weren't there. Instead, he turned, fully, directly, toward the small crowd staring at them. And for the first time in front of the town, Gideon Bale took Nadine's hand. Not gently, not timidly, but firmly, plainly, leaving no room for doubt. "She's with me," he said. His voice was low, steady, carrying across the square. Not a claim of possession, but a promise of protection. Nadine froze. The women fell silent. A breeze passed, carrying the smell of cinnamon and warm cider. She lifted her eyes to him. "Gideon." The words wouldn't come. Tears reached her lashes before she could stop them. Gideon leaned close, his voice softening. "You don't stand alone. Not here. Not while I'm breathing." No one looked at them anymore. Or if they did, it no longer mattered. Gideon guided Nadine deeper into the festival as a slow waltz began. He held out his hand. "Will you dance with me?" Nadine placed her hand in his. Not because of the music, but because his hand was the first place she had felt truly seen. They stepped into the circle of dancers. It wasn't like the dances she'd learned in Eastern ballrooms. Here, the steps were steady, grounded. Gideon's hand settled at her waist, warm, certain, and she leaned into him without meaning to. Lantern light shifted around them, golden and soft. The laughter of others blurred. The world narrowed to his breath near her cheek. Gideon lowered his forehead near hers. "I don't know what the future looks like," he murmured. "But if you want, I can learn." "I'm not asking for much," Nadine whispered. "I just want to know where I belong." His fingers tightened around hers. "Let me be that place." When the music faded, Sheriff Avery approached with a mug of hot cider. "Gideon," he said, half amused, half serious, "you've made quite a statement tonight." Gideon shrugged. "I only told the truth." The sheriff looked at Nadine, kindly, knowingly. "If you two want, I can marry you right now. Year-end festival's a good time to silence every rumor once and for all." The offer hung between them, stilling the air. Gideon looked at Nadine. No urging, no pressure, just a quiet question in his eyes. "Do you want to walk this road with me?" Nadine took a breath. All her life she had run from places she didn't belong. From judgment, from closed doors, from the weight of being seen as less. But here stood a man who had said, for all to hear, "She's with me." A man whose hand held hers like a vow. A man who sheltered her in the snow and asked nothing in return. She nodded. A small nod. But one that shifted the entire world. Gideon exhaled hard, like breath returning to him after years. He took her hand, both hands now holding her as if she were something fragile and precious. "Then let's go," he said softly. The sheriff led the way. They followed hand in hand, past the pie stalls, the lanterns, the silver bells chiming in the wind. Under the winter sky, thick with stars, they walked toward the small chapel at the end of the square. Inside, candles flickered like waiting promises. Outside, the wind hummed like a quiet blessing. They didn't know what the future held. But tonight, they chose each other. Not because of fate, not because of duty, but because two hearts finally knew where they wanted to stay. Spring comes to Clay Ridge not with birdsong, but with the steady drip of melting snow along porch eaves. The fields, long buried under ice, now reveal dark, soft patches of earth carrying the smell of a new season. After a long winter, Bale Ranch wakes like something opening its eyes after heavy sleep. Nadine steps onto the porch at first light, a basket of seeds in her arms. Her coat is light, her hair tied high, the wind catching a few loose curls. She kneels by the patch of ground beneath the kitchen window, where the women who once lived on this ranch used to plant small clusters of flowers. Gideon had told her his mother loved spring more than any other time of year, loved the moment blossoms pushed through the soil, loved placing her hands on the ground to feel the first warmth returning. Nadine sets the seeds into the earth, one handful at a time, as if stitching together something she has no name for. Not replacing, continuing what had once been good. From the porch steps behind her, Gideon watches for a long moment, long enough that Nadine turns and smiles. "You stand like that, and I'm afraid to breathe," she says. He leans against the post. "I just think it's been a long time since this place looked this good." The words stop her hands. A thin ray of sunlight slips through the clouds, stretching his shadow across the ground, like the shadow of a man who lived half his life in the dark and is only now learning how to stand in the light. They spend the morning repairing the barn, hammering new boards, changing out reins, sweeping the yard. Nadine works with the hammer, her hand still marked from the small burn she earned her first week here. Gideon checks each joint, sometimes stepping behind her to steady her hand, sometimes shielding her from a restless horse. They don't talk much, but every time Nadine turns and meets his eyes that soften only for her, she knows their hearts are learning each other's rhythm. When they build the new fence line on the eastern field, Nadine grows tired and bends over with her hands on her knees. Gideon places his hand on her back, pulls her upright, and presses a light kiss to her forehead. "If you're tired, say so," he murmurs. "I'm trying to keep up with your ranch," she answers, half serious. "You belong here already," he says, as if it's the simplest truth in the world. In the afternoon, sunset spreads violet light across the grass. They sit on the porch steps, Nadine's favorite place to end the day. Shoulder to shoulder, no words needed. Gideon wraps his arm behind her, drawing her closer. Nadine rests her head against him, listening to the slow, steady breath of a man who once believed his life had no room left for anyone. Bale Ranch settles into quiet. Kitchen smoke rising in a straight line. Horses moving in soft silhouettes under fading light. The old tree in the yard breaking into the first green buds. Nadine smiles softly. "We did it," she whispers. "What did we do?" Gideon asks. "Built something again, with these two worn hands." He doesn't answer. Instead, he threads his fingers through hers, his rough against her gentle. A small gesture, but between them, it feels like a promise that lasts longer than spring. As the day's last light fades behind the ridge, Nadine stands, dusts off her skirt, and looks toward the house. The same house where she'd once spent a freezing night, and a warm one after. "I don't know what the future looks like," she says, turning back to him. But her smile carries the warmth of early spring. "I just know I want to stay here. With you, at least, for a while longer." Gideon steps closer. He lifts his hand to her cheek, brushing his thumb along her jaw. No declarations. No grand promises. Only the quiet gaze of a man who has finally found somewhere to set his heart down. Bale Ranch never belonged to anyone. The wild here never chose anyone. But they, two people who had lost their direction, chose each other. And for them, that was enough. If this story brings back a memory, a love that once steadied you through hard days, you're welcome to share it below. And if you'd like to keep hearing these gentle, steady Western love stories, feel free to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so we can meet again next time. Thank you for being here and for listening with your whole heart.